Do you know everything about Nintendo? Are you the talk of your school or workplace? Is your name known far and wide across the land as the one true master of Nintendo lore, who has not just caught them all, but understands them all too? If any of this sounds like you might want to find a different video. The good news is that if you don't already know everything, buddy, have we got 10 Nintendo facts for you. Now, these delicious morsels of information about Nintendo aren't state secrets, and most of you will likely know about a few of them. But hopefully all of you don't know all of them being important things to know about the company, especially if you're a huge fan. In the year of our Lord, late-stage capitalism 2021, very few companies out there work how you think they do. So strap in, because we're taking a look at 10 sometimes weird, sometimes cool, and sometimes no good facts about beloved video game maker Nintendo. Before Sony left the Walkman behind and decided to start producing little boxes you could insert these strange new things called compact discs into to play video games on, Sony tried to collaborate with an established player in the video game industry, Nintendo. The story goes like this. Sony wanted in on video games, so they would produce an add-on for the SNES to play disc games, and then would release a new system that would play both cartridges and discs, the Nintendo PlayStation. This obviously didn't work out, and Nintendo announced a deal with rival electronics company Philips to develop a CD-based games platform, leaving Sony to go off and do their own thing. Supposedly, 200 prototype units of the PlayStation exist, and occasionally they're spotted online, on auction for absurd amounts of cash. Nintendo is an old company, that's pretty well known. It's not uncommon for boomer-esque dad types to revere the days of Super Nintendo above all other petty desires of the flesh. But what you might not know is just how old Nintendo actually is. The company was founded way back at the end of the 19th century in 1889. The company was originally founded by Fusajiro Yamauchi to produce Hanafuda, or Japanese playing cards. Through the 1960s, Nintendo experimented with various business models until settling on video games in the late 1970s. Nintendo first gained international acclaim with the release of the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System, in 1977. But by then, the company had been around for nearly 100 years anyway. Back in the days of the Nintendo 64, GoldenEye changed pretty much everything. Shooters on consoles had a bit of a rough start due to the technical limitations of both controls and hardware. But GoldenEye managed to tap into something magic. For many, the magic was at its strongest in the game's multiplayer. What you might not know is that GoldenEye's multiplayer took just 6 weeks to make, all the way at the end of development. According to the composer of the game's music, nobody even liked the idea of multiplayer and were incredibly reluctant to put it together, which is why it only came together late in development. Once it was working, the team began to understand what they had on their hands. But if they had had their way originally, it wouldn't even be part of the game. When we talk about video games today, we often look at Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony as competitors, as peers, as if one company is responding or should respond to another. This idea is deceptively disingenuous, because these three companies exist at vastly different scales. For example, in 2020, Nintendo took in approximately 1.3 trillion yen in revenue. In 2020, Sony took in approximately 8.3 trillion yen in revenue. And Microsoft in 2020 took home a staggering $143 billion in revenue. Nintendo is much smaller than Sony, who is in turn much smaller than Microsoft. This means that on a fundamental level, Nintendo not only doesn't want to directly compete with Microsoft and Sony, it can't. If you're a Smash fan, we're sorry. And you're probably sorry too. If you don't already know, the longest running Smash tournament in the US, the Big House, got hit with a cease and desist from Nintendo because 2020's event reportedly required the use of illegally copied versions of Super Smash Bros. Melee, as well as made use of an unsupported mod, the Slippy Online netcode. Legally speaking, by all accounts, Nintendo seems within their rights. But to shut down a fan-funded, fan-operated passion project literally exclusively about playing one of their games during a year where playing these beloved games with friends and loved ones was particularly hard because of some archaic legal technicality that allows you to do so is in no uncertain terms just a huge middle finger to fans. Joy-Con drift has become the biggest gaming hardware failure scandal since the infamous Red Ring of Death plagued Microsoft's Xbox 360 line of consoles. Nintendo hasn't exactly been great at responding to the disaster. And while a worse problem, Microsoft did eventually acknowledge their problem and at least offer to repair brick consoles. This has led to, in recent memory, a mother suing Nintendo on behalf of her kid because of multiple defective Joy-Cons suffering from the Joy-Con drift issue. If you aren't familiar with the issue itself, it's not complicated. Many Switch users report problems with Joy-Cons drifting, moving without their input over time. This affects different people to different extents and can or cannot be solved by replacing the Joy-Con. To this day, people still think of Nintendo as a company that makes games just for Nintendo platforms. People wonder what life would be like if these games went to other platforms. The good news is you don't have to wait. Nintendo has already launched 7 mobile games on iOS and Android that brings series like Super Mario and Mies and Fire Emblem and Animal Crossing to platforms Nintendo didn't make. There is also a good number of licensed Pokemon games on other platforms out there. Now, no, this isn't a flagship Zelda coming to PC, which would be kind of redundant when you think about an emulator like Cemu. But Nintendo for years has been and continues to bring their games to other platforms. Nintendo is also pretty well known for its consumer-friendly stance on microtransactions. They don't put them in their games. Even still, people were worried in the lead-up to Animal Crossing New Horizons release, wondering if the beloved series would be perverted by microtransactions. That didn't happen, thankfully. But if you want to peek behind the curtains at a darker timeline, you can go ahead and download Animal Crossing Pocket Camp, Nintendo's mobile Animal Crossing game that's stuffed full of all the traditional microtransaction fun you find in mobile games. For a game like Animal Crossing, selling items and money and time savers to the player really messes with the fundamental nature of the game's progression and economy, which can be seen pretty clearly when playing Pocket Camp. If you missed it, Control and Hitman 3 are out now for Switch. The twist is that they're playable on Nintendo's portable console only by way of cloud streaming. Cloud streaming for games has become exponentially more popular with the launch of services like Google Stadia, and the Switch is an excellent candidate for such a service, because the Switch is more than capable of streaming and playing even Cyberpunk 2077 through the cloud. With this technology, the Switch could play PS5 and Series X games without issue. Though, as always with these kinds of services, how livable the latency is going to be the deciding factor, and there's no good way to know how smooth your experience will be until you try it out on your internet connection. Nintendo, like Apple, has a reputation for being unfriendly to modding, modders, emulation, hacks, exploits, all of it. They aren't fans of their fans trying to use their products in ways the company doesn't sanction. What you might not know is that Nintendo is in regular contact with the hacking community. It's not uncommon for Nintendo to approach a certain hacker or discoverer of an exploit and make a deal to pay them, hire them, or sometimes even try and intimidate them into keeping whatever they discovered secret. It's not always some shady process, and the allegations of intense shadiness are, by their nature, impossible to verify. But it's true Nintendo has dealings with hackers in yet another attempt to keep their platforms closed. Thinking back to the first entry on our list, the Nintendo PlayStation, would you still like to see something like that today? Should Nintendo try and compete at the high end and genuinely bring their games to other platforms? Or do you think Nintendo's size and business decisions are what make them the company we all know and love? Us here at The Gamer think it's a little bit of both. But the things made possible by emulators like Cemu and Yuzu are massively inspiring and definitely whet the appetite for Nintendo games on new platforms.